For 15 long years, she didn't just wait, she calculated. Every word, every look, every tear was placed with intention. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was innocent. While everyone else believed they were part of a shared life, she was quietly rewriting the rules of the game. She didn't fight loudly. She didn't need to. The real power was in the silence, in the subtle shifts, in the moments no one thought to question. A glance here, a whisper there, a perfectly timed emotional breakdown that changed the entire direction of a conversation. And slowly, almost invisibly, everything began to revolve around her. What once looked like a family started becoming something else. Piece by piece, bond by bond, the structure weakened. Not in a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, controlled collapse. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late. Because the end goal was always the same point: one man, one relationship, one position at the center of it all. And now, she finally has it. But here's the part no one expected. Winning didn't look like victory. It looked heavy, exhausting, almost suffocating. Because standing there today, with everything she once fought for, she doesn't look fulfilled. She doesn't look peaceful. She doesn't even look relieved. She looks trapped. The dream she spent years building has turned into something completely different. Something darker. Something far more complicated than she ever imagined. Because the prize at the center of it all isn't what it used to be. Kody Brown is no longer the same man everyone once saw. The calm, composed figure has been replaced by someone far more unpredictable. Frustration sits just beneath the surface. Anger lingers in his tone. And the cracks are no longer easy to hide. And standing beside him is Robyn Brown, the woman who finally got exactly what she wanted. But instead of peace, she's facing pressure. Instead of security, she's facing instability. And instead of control, she's losing it, because now there's no one else left. No distractions. No buffer. No one to absorb the tension. For years, the chaos had somewhere to go. There were other relationships, other dynamics, other people to carry the weight. But now, it all lands in one place, and that changes everything. The arguments feel sharper. The silence feels louder. Even the smallest issues seem to explode into something much bigger. What used to be shared across multiple relationships is now concentrated into one intense, unavoidable reality. And behind closed doors, that reality is reportedly becoming harder to manage, because this isn't just emotional pressure. It's financial too. For a long time, the lifestyle worked because it was supported by multiple incomes, multiple contributions, multiple streams holding everything together. But now, that system is gone. What's left is a much heavier burden carried by 5 fewer people. And that shift is starting to show. There are whispers of stress building behind the scenes, of spending habits being questioned, of decisions being challenged, of tension rising over things that were once ignored. Because when the safety net disappears, every choice matters more, every mistake feels bigger, every disagreement hits harder, and slowly, the cracks start becoming impossible to hide. Even in public appearances, the difference is noticeable. The energy has changed. The confidence isn't the same. The ease is gone. There's a tension now, a distance, a sense that something underneath the surface isn't right. And people are starting to notice, because the story that was once being told no longer matches what's being seen. For years, the narrative was clear. She was the emotional one, the sensitive one, the one trying to hold everything together while everyone else pulled it apart. But now, that narrative is being questioned, because when you remove all the other pieces, what's left becomes impossible to ignore, and what's left is complicated. There's no one else to blame anymore. No one else to point to. No one else to stand between the tension. Just two people, facing the full weight of everything that's been building for years. And that kind of pressure changes people. It reveals things. It forces truths to the surface that can't be hidden behind emotion or distraction anymore. And that's where things start to get really uncomfortable. Because the life she worked so hard to create is starting to feel like something she can't escape from. The independence she thought she'd gain has turned into isolation. The control she thought she'd have is slipping. And the security she believed in is starting to look uncertain. That's why some believe something unexpected could happen next. Not out of desire, but out of necessity. The idea of bringing someone new into the picture has been quietly discussed, not as a dream, but as a solution. A way to shift the pressure. A way to change the dynamic. A way to survive what's happening now, but if that option is gone, then what's left? That's the real question. Because staying means continuing in a situation that's becoming harder to manage and leaving. That comes with its own risks, its own consequences, its own unknowns, and somewhere in the middle of all that is fear, real fear. Not of losing a family, but of losing everything. Because when everything is tied together, emotionally, financially, legally, walking away isn't simple. It's complicated. It's messy. And it changes everything. That's why some believe quiet steps may already be happening behind the scenes. Conversations, decisions, preparations, nothing confirmed. But enough to raise questions, because when pressure builds for long enough, something always gives. And right now, it feels like things are getting closer to that point. At the same time, there's another layer to this story: relevance, because for years, the dynamic of multiple relationships, multiple personalities, multiple conflicts, that was the story. That's what people followed. That's what kept everything alive. But now, that dynamic is gone, and without it, things feel different, quieter, smaller, less compelling, which raises another question. What happens when the story itself starts to fade? Because without the bigger picture, without the other voices, without the contrast, what's left? And more importantly, is it enough? That's the part no one can answer yet, but one thing is clear. This isn't the ending anyone expected. It's not the victory it was supposed to be. It's something far more complicated, far more uncomfortable, and far more real. Because sometimes, getting exactly what you want doesn't bring happiness. Sometimes, it brings clarity. And that clarity can be the hardest thing to face, because now, there's nowhere to hide. No distractions, no illusions, just reality. And for the first time, those emotions that once felt controlled, calculated, almost performative, might actually be real. So the question now isn't how the story started, it's how it ends. Because from where things stand today, this doesn't feel like closure. It feels like the beginning of something else, something uncertain, something unstable, something that could change everything, all over again. And if you've been following this journey closely, you already know this is the moment where everything shifts. So tell me, what do you think happens next? Does she stay and fight through it? Or does she finally walk away from the very life she worked so hard to build? For 15 long years, she didn't just wait. She planned. Quietly, carefully, patiently. While everyone else believed they were living a shared dream, she was slowly reshaping it into something else entirely. Something more controlled, more focused, more personal. It never looked obvious on the surface. That's what made it so powerful. There were no loud confrontations, no dramatic ultimatums, just small, calculated moments that kept shifting everything in her favor. A pause before speaking, a tear at the exact right second, a fragile tone that made every argument lean in her direction. And over time, those small moments added up. Conversations began to change. Decisions started to feel one-sided. Priorities shifted. Attention moved. And without anyone fully realizing it, the balance inside the family began to collapse. Not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece. Because this was never about chaos. It was about control. And control doesn't need noise. It works best in silence. First, it felt like nothing more than emotional sensitivity. Someone trying to be understood. Someone asking for fairness. Someone who just wanted stability. But look closer, and a different picture starts to form, because every time tension appeared, it somehow redirected. Every time conflict rose, it landed somewhere else. And every time decisions were made, they leaned in one direction. Her direction. What once felt like a shared structure began turning into something centered around one relationship. And that shift, it didn't happen by accident. It was built carefully, intentionally, over years. While others were trying to hold things together, she was quietly redefining what together even meant. And eventually, the cracks became impossible to ignore, because when attention is uneven, when time isn't shared, when effort feels one-sided, relationships don't just weaken, they break point one by one. The distance grew, the laughter faded, the connection thinned. The sense of unity that once defined everything started slipping away, and still, the same pattern continued. More time here, less time there, more understanding for one, less patience for others, and slowly, the entire structure that once held everything together began falling apart, until finally, There was almost nothing left. No balance. No unity. No shared life. Just the outcome she had been moving toward all along. Point one man, point one relationship, point one center. And now, standing in that position, she has exactly what she fought for. But here's where everything changes. Because getting what you want doesn't always feel the way you imagined. Especially when the path to get there changes everything along the way. Robyn Brown now sits in a place that once looked like victory. The position of importance. The center of attention. The person everything revolves around. But instead of peace, there's tension. Instead of comfort, there's pressure. And instead of happiness, there's something much harder to hide, because the man at the center of it all isn't the same anymore. Kody Brown has changed. The calm, confident presence people once recognized has been replaced by something more unpredictable. There's frustration now. A visible edge. A sense that something underneath the surface isn't settled. And when that kind of energy has nowhere to go, it doesn't disappear. It builds for years. That pressure had multiple outlets, multiple relationships, multiple dynamics to absorb it. If one connection felt strained, there were others to balance it out. But now, there's only one place left for it to land. And that changes everything. Because when all the focus, all the emotion, all the tension is concentrated in one space, it becomes impossible to escape. Every disagreement feels bigger, every silence feels heavier, every small issue suddenly matters more than it should, and slowly, the reality of that situation starts to sink in. This isn't the shared life that once existed. This is something entirely different. Something far more intense, far more personal, and far more difficult to manage, because now, there's no one else to carry the weight. No one else to soften the impact. No one else to stand between the rising tension. Just two people, facing everything directly. And when there's nowhere left to redirect emotion, it starts turning inward, toward the only person left in the room. That's when things begin to shift in ways no one can ignore, because the same patterns that once affected others don't just disappear. They repeat, they redirect, and eventually, they come back around, which means the dynamic that once worked in her favor may not be working the same way anymore. Because control becomes much harder to maintain when there's no one left to influence. No one left to compare against. No one left to shift the narrative toward just reality, and reality doesn't bend as easily. That's why, if you look closely now, the energy feels different, the confidence isn't as strong. The presence isn't as steady. There's a tension there, a subtle shift that suggests something deeper is happening behind the scenes, something that isn't being said out loud, but can definitely be felt. Because when someone spends years building a specific outcome and finally reaches it, the truth becomes impossible to avoid. Was it really worth it? Or did the cost end up being higher than expected? That question is starting to linger. And it's not an easy one to answer, because the life that once felt like a goal is now a reality that has to be lived every single day, with no escape. No distraction. No buffer, just the full weight of everything that's been built over time. And that weight, it's getting heavier. And the deeper this reality settles in, the harder it becomes to ignore what's really happening, because now, it's no longer about perception. It's no longer about how things look from the outside. It's about what it feels like behind closed doors. What once seemed manageable now feels overwhelming. What once felt controlled now feels unpredictable, and what once looked like a carefully built life is starting to feel unstable. Because when everything narrows down to just one relationship, there's nowhere left to hide the cracks. Every flaw becomes visible. Every frustration becomes louder, every emotion becomes heavier, and slowly, the truth starts to surface. For a long time, the situation worked because it was spread out. Attention was divided. Energy was shared. Pressure was distributed across multiple people, multiple connections, multiple dynamics. But now, there's no distribution anymore. Everything is concentrated, and concentration creates intensity. That's why even the smallest things don't feel small anymore. A disagreement isn't just a disagreement. It turns into tension that lingers. A quiet moment isn't peaceful. It feels heavy, loaded, uncomfortable. Even silence starts saying things words don't. And when two people are living inside that kind of environment every single day, it changes them. It changes how they react. It changes how they communicate, and most importantly, it changes how they see each other. Kody Brown is no longer dividing his time, his attention, or his emotions. Everything is focused in one place. And that level of focus, it can either strengthen something or completely break it. Because there's no escape from it.no reset button.no stepping away into another dynamic to cool down. Just the same space. The same energy, the same unresolved tension, repeating over and over again. And for Robyn Brown, this is a completely different experience than anything before, because for years, she wasn't the only one feeling that pressure. Now she is, and that shift is hitting hard, because the version of control that once existed depended on having multiple moving parts, multiple people, multiple perspectives, multiple outcomes. But now, there's only one dot, and when there's only one, there's nothing left to manage except the reality itself. And reality doesn't always cooperate. That's where the emotional weight starts becoming impossible to carry, because when there's no one else to share the experience with, everything feels more intense, more personal, more direct, and more difficult to escape from. That's why some moments now reportedly feel unpredictable. Not because something dramatic always happens, but because the atmosphere itself has changed. It's tense, it's fragile, and at times, it feels like it could shift at any second. Because when frustration builds without release, it doesn't disappear. It grows. And when it finally comes out, it doesn't come out quietly. It shows up in tone. In reactions. In the way small situations suddenly become much bigger than they should be. And when that pattern repeats over time, it creates a cycle. A cycle that's hard to break. Because both people start reacting not just to what's happening in the moment, but to everything that's been building underneath it. That's when communication starts breaking down. Not completely, but enough to create distance. Enough to create misunderstanding. Enough to create that feeling of being in the same space, but not on the same page. And that's where things become even more complicated. Because from the outside, it might still look like stability. It might still look like everything is in place. But on the inside, there's pressure. There's tension. And there's a growing sense that something isn't right. Something that can't be easily explained, but can definitely be felt. Because when a dynamic shifts this drastically, it doesn't just affect the relationship. It affects everything around it. Daily routines, decisions, emotional responses, even the way silence is experienced. Nothing feels quite the same anymore. And when that realization starts sinking in, it raises a difficult question. What happens next? Because staying in that kind of environment long term isn't easy. But changing it, that's even harder, because change requires facing the truth. And the truth isn't always comfortable. It means acknowledging that the outcome doesn't match the expectation, that the reality doesn't match the dream, and that the path taken to get here may have led somewhere completely different than intended. That's a heavy realization, and it doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly, moment by moment, until one day, it becomes impossible to ignore. And when that moment comes, something has to give. Either the dynamic changes, or the situation itself does. Because no environment filled with that much pressure stays the same forever. It either breaks, or it transforms, and right now, it feels like things are moving closer to that breaking point. At a point where decisions can't be delayed anymore, where emotions can't be hidden anymore, where reality demands to be faced fully. And that's where everything becomes uncertain, because uncertainty brings fear. Fear of what happens if things stay the same, and fear of what happens if they change. Both directions carry risk. Both directions carry consequences, and neither one feels easy. That's the position now, caught between what was wanted and what actually exists, between control and reality, between holding on and letting go. And somewhere in that space, the pressure continues to build, slowly, quietly, but powerfully, until eventually, something shifts, because it always does. And when that shift finally begins, it doesn't arrive with a warning. It creeps in quietly. At first, it feels like nothing more than a change in mood. A little more silence than usual. A little less patience. Conversations that used to flow now feel forced. Eye contact that once felt natural now feels avoided. Small things easy to ignore, but they don't stay small for long. Because when pressure has been building for this long, it eventually finds a way out. And when it does, it changes everything. The atmosphere inside that home no longer feels like a place of comfort. It feels heavy. Unsettled. Like something is always just beneath the surface, waiting for the wrong moment to rise. And the hardest part, there's no distraction left. No external noise to drown it out. No other relationships to soften the intensity. Just two people, sitting in the reality they created, facing it. Every single day. For Robyn Brown, this is where the emotional weight becomes impossible to ignore, because the identity she carried for so long doesn't fit the situation anymore. For years, She was seen as the one trying to keep peace, the one navigating tension, the one reacting to everything happening around her. But now, there is no around. There is only this, and that changes how everything is experienced, because when you remove all the external factors, what's left becomes clear, uncomfortably clear, and clarity can be overwhelming, because it forces questions that were never asked before. Was this really the goal? Was this really the outcome that was worth everything it cost? And more importantly, is this something that can actually be lived with long-term? Those questions don't have easy answers, and they don't come with quick solutions. They sit there, in the background, growing louder over time. Because when reality doesn't match expectation, the mind doesn't just ignore it. It tries to make sense of it over and over again. And that process is exhausting. At the same time, Kody Brown is going through his own shift, because the environment around him has completely changed. The dynamics that once defined his life are gone. There are no longer multiple perspectives to balance. No competing energies. No variation. Everything is now centered in one place. One relationship. One dynamic. One constant presence. And that kind of change affects behavior. It affects emotion, and it affects how frustration is handled, because when there are fewer outlets, everything becomes more direct, more immediate, more intense, and over time, that intensity builds. It shows up in reactions. In tone. In the way small moments suddenly feel bigger than they are, and when both people are experiencing that at the same time, it creates a loop. A pattern that feeds itself. Tension creates distance. Distance creates misunderstanding. Misunderstanding creates more tension, and the cycle continues again and again and again, until something interrupts it. Or something breaks it, because no cycle like that lasts forever without consequences. That's why some believe the situation is reaching a point where decisions can't be avoided anymore. Not small decisions, big ones. The kind that change direction completely. Because staying in a situation that feels this heavy requires constant effort, constant adjustment, constant emotional energy, and eventually, that energy runs out. That's when people start thinking differently. Not about how to fix things, but about how to survive them. And survival thinking changes everything, because it shifts the